All right, let's talk about ethics. Specifically, the moral principles that are the absolute bedrock of any credible social science. We're going to break down how researchers can explore the super complex world of human behavior while still doing the right thing.
And really, it all boils down to this one central question. How do we chase after knowledge? How do we uncover these vital truths about our world without hurting the very people we're trying to understand? That's the tightrope walk we're going to be exploring.
So, to kick things off, let's get on the same page. What are we actually talking about when we say research ethics? Think of it as a moral compass for anyone doing research. It's not just a dusty old rule book. It's a deep commitment to making sure that how you collect, analyze, and share your data always puts the rights and well-being of your participants first.
And that leads us straight into our first big topic. The protections that absolutely must be there for every single person in a study. Seriously, this part is non-negotiable.
And the absolute cornerstone, the foundation of it all, is informed consent. The big idea here is that people get to freely choose if they want to be in a study, and they make that choice with a full, clear, and honest picture of what they're signing up for.
So what does that actually look like? Well, a real consent form is way more than just a quick signature. It has to lay everything out. What the research is for, what you'll actually have to do, and any potential risks or even benefits. And this part is huge. It has to screen from the rooftops that taking part is 100% voluntary and that you can bail at any time for any reason, no questions asked. It also has to promise how it'll protect your privacy and give you a way to contact the researcher if you have questions.
Okay, but here's where it gets tricky. There's this thing called the Hawthorne effect, where people act differently simply because they know they're being watched. So what happens when a researcher is worried that being totally upfront might mess up the results? This is where we get into the really thorny issue of intentional deception. Sometimes, and I mean very rarely, it can be okay, but only if it meets some super strict criteria. The risk of harm has to be basically zero, and the deception has to be the only way to do the study, like if you're staging a public incident to see how people react naturally. And afterwards, a full debriefing where you explain everything is an absolute must. Now, it's never okay if there's another way to do the research, if the risk of harm is high, or if it involves tricking people about medical treatments, like with placebos. That's a huge red line. But protecting people isn't just about getting their consent at the beginning. Even with their permission, a researcher has a massive responsibility to protect their personal information. And that brings us to privacy.
You know, researchers have to think about three really important things here. 1, how sensitive is the information? I mean, your political views are a lot more personal than your favorite brand of cereal. 2, what's the setting? Observing people in a public park is a whole different ballgame than recording a therapy session. And finally, 3, how are you going to share what you've found? You have to present it in a way that makes it impossible to figure out who said what. The promise is simple. Your name will never be attached to your answers.
Okay, so we've covered the core protections for participants. Now, let's zoom out and look at how ethics isn't just one step, but something that's baked into the entire research process, from the first idea to the final report.
See, this is what's so important to get. Ethics isn't an afterthought you tack on at the end. It starts at the very beginning. When you choose your topic, you have to ask, is my question biased? Then, when you pick your sample, you have to ask, does this group really represent who I'm trying to study? Then you choose the right method, you treat every single person fairly, and at the very end, you report what you found with total, brutal honesty.
And that last part, reporting, that's where the pressure can really mount. It's where some researchers give in to the temptation of scientific misconduct, and this dishonesty can show up in a few different ways. First up, you've got fabrication. This is the big one. It's just straight up inventing data, making things up. It's the ultimate betrayal of what science is all about, and it can have disastrous consequences if people make real-world decisions based on fake information. Then there's something a little more subtle, called trimming. This is when a researcher kind of smooths out the rough edges of their data. They might throw out a few results that don't quite fit their theory to make everything look a little neater and more convincing than it actually is. It's still a form of manipulation.
And finally, we have cooking the data. This is basically cherry picking. So instead of changing the data, you just ignore the parts you don't like. You only report the results that support your hypothesis and conveniently leave out all the stuff that contradicts it. Both trimming and cooking are major ethical no-nos.
All right, let's shift gears, because all of these principles we've talked about, they were born in a world of in-person interviews and paper surveys. But what happens to ethics in the world we live in now, the digital world?
We are officially in the era of big data. Every click, every like, every post generates these massive, sprawling datasets. And for social researchers, this new digital frontier brings a whole new universe of ethical headaches.
And this slide just nails the core problem. The very idea of a participant has changed. In traditional research, you knew you were in a study. You were asked, you said yes. But online, a participant might just be someone whose public tweets are being analyzed for a study they will never, ever know exists. The whole idea of consent gets incredibly fuzzy.
And this creates all sorts of new problems. There's this concept of implied consent, the idea that just by using a social media platform, you're agreeing to have your data used for research. Then there's cybersecurity. Researchers now have a moral duty to protect all that digital data from being hacked. And what about anonymity? If you analyze someone's public Facebook posts, can you really truly promise that no one will ever figure out who they are? It's a tough question. So, with all these new challenges, it really brings the focus back to the one constant in this whole equation, the integrity of the researcher themselves. Look, having official rules and review boards is absolutely necessary, but at the end of the day, they're not enough. Real ethical research has to come from inside. It's a personal, ongoing commitment to honesty, to accountability, and to taking responsibility for the impact of your work. And I want to leave you with this really powerful idea from a researcher named Matthew Salganik. He says if you're writing about the ethics of your study and you start to feel a little squirmy, a little uncomfortable, that's a huge sign that something might be wrong. It's a reminder that your own gut feeling, your own moral compass, is maybe the most important guide you have. It pushes us beyond asking, can I do this? And makes us ask the much more important question, should I?